to everyone who's watching and listening. My name's Hannah David. I'm one of the directors of Planning Futures, a planning and housing think tank. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this collaborative event looking at the post-COVID-19 high street, something that is particularly relevant with bearing in mind the recent announcement that non-essential shops will in fact be opening on Monday together with zoos. I don't know if that's relevant to the conversation, but it was just an interesting fact that I heard today. I am delighted to welcome everyone. This is our second virtual breakfast webinar, and I particularly want to welcome not only our panelists, but also the over 100 registered attendees for this event. Just to outline the format for this event, I'm going to do a very brief introduction, and then I'm going to introduce each panelist in turn, who will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. This will then be followed by a Q&A. And can I please ask that those who are attending, if you have any questions, please use your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and submit the questions throughout. It can be throughout the panel discussion or after, whenever, and then I will pick the questions at the end to ask the panelists. If you wish to be anonymous, then when you ask your question, then please change your name, but Father Christmas will not get a look in. But please change your name or mention your name and your company if you would like a mention. I would also mention that this session is being recorded and notes will be taken and circulated afterwards. To begin, as advertised, the subject of the panel today is the post-COVID-19 high street. And it strikes us all, and particularly me, that this is going to be a particularly important topic for everyone that's involved in planning, in housing, and in the broader real estate sector. And before any of us had even heard of COVID-19, the high street was definitely something of a hot topic for our industry. The shift, obviously, towards online shopping and the loss of office space in many town centres has meant that many of the high streets were already experiencing an identity crisis. And I feel and fear that these trends will just be accelerated over the coming months and years as a result of this period of lockdown. I'm delighted, therefore, that we have this really excellent and diverse panel to discuss this issue. We have a solicitor, we have a planning consultant, and we have someone involved in the leisure industry, all very relevant factors when considering what's going to happen to our high streets moving forward. So without further ado, let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Roger Hepher is one of the UK's most experienced planning consultants with a wide range of experience across all sectors and in most parts of the United Kingdom. He holds a degree in town and country planning and a master's in town planning. He's a fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and an academician of the Academy of Urbanism. After successfully heading Hepher Dixon from the mid-1990s, Roger was Savills National Head of Planning, leading a team of nearly 200 planners from 1988 to 2014, and he sat on the board of Savills UK. He co-founded the company that is now HGH Consulting in 2016. He's active in the affairs of the British Property Federation and London First. He was a member of the coalition government's planning sound board, was appointed by Nick Bowles, the then planning minister, as a red tape challenge champion, and was a member of the expert panel advising Bridget Rosewell OBE's review of planning appeal inquiries. Roger is an experienced planning strategist and leader of professional teams. He has considerable experience as an expert witness at public inquiries, planning hearings, development plan examinations, upper tribunal, formerly Lands Tribunal hearings, CPO inquiries, High Court proceedings, and select committee hearings. So over to you, Roger. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. I really should edit that biography down a bit, shouldn't I? What, what you didn't mention is that until about 3 months ago, I used to go to shops on high streets occasionally. Um, what I'd like to do is to just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. As you've explained, at HGH Consulting, we have a team of 24 planners. We act predominantly for landowners, developers, retailers, so commercial organizations primarily who need planning permission for whatever. And we operate across all sectors of property, but that most definitely includes retail, leisure, offices, and the other components of high streets. I think, I'm just trying to move my slides on, having some difficulty, so bear with me a second. Yeah. So I think we need to think here in terms of both the short term and the long term. You know, clearly, the high streets are in a very sick state at the moment. And in the short, or that really should say short and medium term, an awful lot needs to be done to enable them, help them recover from COVID. But of course, it's not just COVID, it's the deep economic recession that we're now in, and which is not going to be dissipated quickly or easily. We've already had some measures coming out of government, the ability for restaurants and pubs to serve takeaway food. We're promised or led to expect that very shortly there will be relaxations about outdoor eating and drinking, although I'd note that that brings into play licensing law as well as planning. And we're seeing local authorities introduce temporary pedestrianisation measures and cycle provision to encourage people to get back to the high streets and be comfortable using them. All good stuff. I think definitely to be encouraged. And I'm sure that amongst the many participants this morning, there'll be lots of other ideas, and it would be very good if people could table those ideas through the Q&A mechanism. And I'm sure several of us will be very happy to sort of feed those up to the ministry. So that's the short-term position, but that's only half the picture. And again, I'm just sort of slightly struggling here with my slides. The fact is that high streets have been facing major challenges, structural challenges for quite a long period of time now. And I list here what I think those challenges are. The first is the very obvious shift of retailing from traditional shops to online. You know, clearly a massive change that's been ongoing now for 10 years or so and gathering momentum all the time. But of course, it's not just retail per se, it's services as well. So you know, banking, for instance, and travel agency and employment agency, they're all services that you used to find on the high street. Well, you still do to an extent, but they're very much in the process of being replaced by online provision. And then home-based leisure, you know, the expansion of Deliveroo and its equivalents, the availability of high-quality home entertainment and the ready availability of high-quality audio equipment to enable people to enjoy it at home, social media, people no longer have the same need to go to places for leisure. And then a further important factor is that as a society, as a planning system, we are trying hard to move to a more sustainable world. We're trying to address the climate change challenge. We're trying to encourage people not to use their cars, not to travel more than necessary. So all of these things are challenges which are heaped upon the high street. I'm now just going to move to some of the long-term measures that, well, are being taken and perhaps ought, in my opinion, to be taken. And I'm tabling these, very much for discussion amongst the panel, but also hopefully to provoke some comment from other participants. The first point here is that I think it's inevitable that most, if not all, shopping centres will contract. Contraction means less space, and it probably means diversification, allowing new uses to come into high streets. It's easily said. It's much more difficult to achieve, basically because high streets are what they are. They're often sort of spread out over quite some geographical area. And if you were starting from scratch, you probably wouldn't plan the 2020 high street or the 2030 high street in the way that most high streets currently are. And replanning what exists is a big challenge, I think, for planning authorities. What we have seen in recent years is government introducing various measures at a national level to allow permitted development rights to change between use classes or to change from retail to residential. I suppose all well-meaning in that it's recognizing that there needs to be more diversification and that there needs to be retail space decommissioned. But I think potentially capable of having quite adverse consequences, because what you want is to move to a situation where you have a new consolidation of the center rather than taking out buildings here and here and here quite randomly and converting them to other uses and breaking up consistent frontages. That brings me on to the second point, which is, I think quite strongly that we need to have what I've called here local granular measures taken. I'm not a great fan of top-down permitted development rights, one size fits all everywhere, because it doesn't. Every centre is different and needs to be understood in its own terms. My third point here is, I think the scope for planning authorities to be more creative in the way in which they zone centres. We've long had primary frontages and secondary frontages identified and given some measure of planning protection. But I think we need to be more creative and perhaps bolder in future in specifically creating planning policy to channel certain uses into certain parts of centres and to accept in other parts that there will be considerable change. Fourth point is local planning authorities are making investment in town centres to make them more attractive. That's definitely, I think, something that needs to continue. And we're not just talking here about place-making measures, but we certainly are talking about those, but talking about being prepared to allow new uses which will attract people, organising festivals, artistic events, etc., potentially a very wide range of things on the palette. Fifth point, I wonder whether we don't need to think in terms of something like the comprehensive redevelopment that was undertaken by many authorities, many planning authorities back in the 1960s and 70s. I don't think the solutions adopted then are the solutions appropriate now, but I think there definitely is a case for planning authorities being bold and being prepared to directly intervene, using compulsory purchase powers if appropriate, forming partnerships with landowners and developers and retailers, and proactively encouraging new forms of development and rationalization. That brings me on to the use classes order. By and large, we're still working with the use classes order that was drawn up in 1987. An awful lot has changed in the meantime, and I think we now have a need for a review of that order and perhaps a more fine-grained use classes order and permitted development rights to go with it. Then I've been talking about the things that planning authorities perhaps should be doing. I'm also keen to see experimentation and risk-taking within a sensible planning environment. And I'd very much like to see a reinvigoration of the presumption in favor of sustainable development that was originally introduced, of course, with the NPPF in 2012, and which I feel has rather lost its momentum over the last 8 years. I'd really like to see interesting ideas and initiative supported by the planning system. And then finally, one reason why our high streets have been under so much pressure in recent years is because of the large amount of big box retailing that has taken place being outside centres. We now have the interesting situation where many of the retail businesses operating those big boxes are going out of business or rationalizing. They no longer need so much space. I'm quite an enthusiast for redeveloping that space with housing or new workspace or whatever it is, and taking that capacity out of the system and thus leaving more capacity for the high streets. And Hannah, I'm going to stop there and hand over the screen to others.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, obviously you've raised a multitude of issues, I'm sure of which will, I've already got some questions in on the points that you've raised. So we'll come on to that in a minute. If we could just move over, please, to our next speaker, which is Stephen Porter. So Stephen is a founding member of JPC and heads the commercial property team, as well as being the firm's senior partner, bringing over 40 years of legal experience to the firm. He qualified ostensibly as a litigator, and he understands both the contentious and non-contentious aspects of commercial property law. Stephen specialises in the leisure and hospitality sector. He's also dealt with both large and small developments to date. He has a wealth of experience in dealing with secured lending, both for mainstream and short-term lenders, and acts for a number of bridging finance companies, having drafted their standard documentation. He has also prepared the standard leases for a major housing association. Not only a respected solicitor, Stephen is also one of our CEDR accredited mediators. Stephen is known for a straightforward and holistic approach to all legal matters, and his litigation expertise has led to his successful involvement in the landmark Court of Appeal case, P&P Property Limited and Owen White and Caitlin. The groundbreaking and highly publicised cases of P&P and Dreamvar continue to have significant implications for the legal profession and led to the Law Society updating the Conveyancing Code for Completion, which came into force in May 2019. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. and good morning, everybody. I think in these difficult times, it has brought to a head a lot of issues which have been bubbling under the surface and have yet to be properly addressed. As an example, the rents that have been payable in the leisure market in central London have been very high and are just about sustainable. But unfortunately, with those units now which are closed, it's going to be an issue with them actually opening up when they're allowed to by the government. If you take an average high-end restaurant or in central London or even a sort of medium-sized restaurant in central London, in order for them to pay their way, they have to have a minimum number of covers and also rely on the tourist trade. In consequence, when these establishments are allowed to reopen, it will not be like switching on a light. The tourist trade will definitely not be there, certainly in the short term, and probably in the medium term as well. And the domestic market is likely to be diminished. It seems to me, therefore, that a lot of these establishments will simply not reopen because they will not be able to afford to do so, even with government support. This may be the case even if landlords are prepared to renegotiate rents. And I think probably Maurice has more experience of this and will be speaking about this, but it's a pretty variable picture as to whether landlords are amenable to changing reducing rents or not. In addition, one also has to look at the high street. Again, many units which are unable to open will simply not have the resources, or may even decide that it's simply not worth taking on more debt in order to open up again. In the circumstances, it is likely that the reality will be that high streets will be littered with empty units. As regards central London units, which may also become empty, there will be a need for some creativity and innovation to stimulate a market for those units. Landlords may have to, as example, take a leap of faith and allow pop-up businesses and just allow a bit more flexibility where they have been fairly rigid up to now. As far as the high street is concerned, it seems to me that because many units will become empty, there is really no prospect of them being relet in their traditional use. This has been coming anyway because of, as Roger said, the online purchasing of items that could otherwise be bought in the high street, and also development of retail shopping centres which are more convenient for people to visit. But even shopping centres are not immune from the combination of the growth of the online shopping combined with the lockdown. As an example, you may have read that Ballymore, who, as you know, are big residential developers, are on the verge of buying the Broadwater Shopping Centre in Edgware for £75 million to redevelop it into 3,500 homes. So there is an opportunity there for some to see that housing might replace some of the areas that are currently being used for retail. In addition to what I say, the leisure market, regarding the leisure market, I think it's also fair to say that the office market will also be looking at a changed environment. Many offices, including our own, have been closed for a while. And actually, what it's highlighted is that many people can work from home. So I think a lot of offices, a lot of businesses are reevaluating their space to see whether or not they can actually make do with less space than they've got at the moment. And this may also result in there being an excess of office space and reduction in rents. In addition to many businesses having, of course, suffered financially because of the lockdown, every business will want to ensure their survival and profitability, and it's therefore inevitable, and I suppose put it euphemistically, there will be restructuring, i.e. redundancies. So there's going to be a number of people who unfortunately were going to lose their jobs as a result of the lockdown. I think that's an inevitability. It would seem, therefore, there's every possibility that there will be less demand for office spaces than there are at the moment. I've highlighted in broad terms what I see as the immediate and longer term challenges in the commercial market, but I do think there are certain things that can be done, and I think there also needs to be there is a need for a more agile market to meet the requirements as they come about. I think one has to look at where there is a need for space. Now, I think it's fair to say that there is one constant need, which is for housing. And the current crisis has not changed that position, as there's still a shortage of housing. And in the short term, this probably has made the situation worse because of the lockdown and because of the inability for developers to actually carry out their developments. If you take a high street, for example, I don't see personally, although I'm not a planner per se, but I don't see personally why it's necessarily a problem for high street to be a mixed use of retail and housing. In fact, if you look at a lot of small towns around the country, they're already like that anyway, and that's how they've developed. In terms of flexibility of use, again, something that Roger touched on, which is the use classes order. And I think it is fair to say it's not fit for purpose, and indeed it hasn't been fit for purpose for quite a while. In many respects, it makes flexibility of use difficult, leaving aside that a number of uses simply don't fit in with the uses that are listed within it. Many of these uses, which are known as sui generis uses, are basically uses which did not fit in with the original specified uses. And this list has got larger as the list has, as time has gone on. So there's now a growing list of sui generis uses, which simply just highlights how out of date it is. Also, from a practical perspective, we as solicitors, and I think that this also touches on what Morris does, is that there's often this problem with, say, as an example, with what is a cafe? Is a cafe an A1 use retail, or is it an A3 use restaurant? Unfortunately, in my experience, what happens is that each local authority seems to have a slightly different view as to what constitutes an A1 use or an A3 use. And it's really, it's a constant problem. So I think that needs to be addressed. So I think there is an urgent need for the current use classes order to be revamped so that there is a greater flexibility and clarity as to what uses there can be. And as you probably know, to an extent, the government have already addressed that problem under their emergency legislation by introducing a new planning use class called use class DA, which is a temporary use up to the 23rd of March 2021, which allows restaurants that previously weren't allowed to provide takeaway services to actually enable them to do so. I also think that there needs to be a more flexible approach to things like the use of external space, so that if a restaurant's got external space which is not going to, by being used, it's not going to block out anything, it can be used. There should be more flexibility in terms of those establishments being able to use that space. The lockdown, I think, has highlighted numerous challenges and issues in the property market, and the ones I've mentioned are simply just a few of them, and there does need to be a really holistic look at how the market's going to change in the future. That's what I've got to say at this stage, but I would welcome any questions that anybody wishes to raise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, I can actually say that it's rare that we have a Planning Futures event and the inadequacy of the use classes order doesn't come up. So this is definitely something that seems to be right up there on the agenda that needs re-looking at. Moving on to our final speaker is Maurice Greenberg from CDG Leisure. So Maurice started at Gilmark Associates in 1998, focusing on the leisure and property markets in the UK. Since then, the business has evolved into CDG Leisure and has become one of the most active boutique leisure agencies based in Soho, which is London W1. Maurice has established himself as a creative and personable deal maker, having been involved in bringing and expanding key international and national operators into the UK, such as Halal Guys, Taco Bell, Wingstop, Five Guys, KFC, the Ivy Group, JKS Restaurants, Honest Burger, Burger and Lobster, to name just a few. CDG Leisure advises landlords such as Shaftesbury PLC, Pearl & Coote, Soho Estates and the Fraser Group, and have been influential in the remodernisation of Chinatown's food and beverage offerings. With his experience in the industry and his ability to really understand client needs, he manages to put new and established buyers into the market using his knowledge and ability to make sure that the most difficult deals have a good end result for everyone. So Maurice, over to you, please.
Thanks, Hannah, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I mean, look, 2020 started on a real high for the whole of the leisure market. I mean, it was, January, February was rocking and rolling. It was the impacts of Brexit were beginning to heal, and UK's leisure market was getting as strong as it ever was again. And, chains were expanding. Private equity companies were investing, which was well publicised, and internationals were banging on our door to get into the UK, especially the London market. Independents were coming through. It was really going strong. Premiums were big, the premiums being the key money for these sites. And it was mentioned before, rents were increasing, but the rents were increasing purely because of the strength of the market and the massive increase in demand that we were getting from the beginning of 2020, as I say, with Brexit long gone. So it was a big demand for premises. March came, Covid-19 overnight destroyed the industry. I mean, literally wiped it out. I mean, it went from hero to zero overnight. And I think for the first 6 weeks, it was just the realization of what had happened to people. I mean, we were on the phone, my team and me, we were on the phone to many operators at this time, and it was just trying to get an understanding of where this is going to go, what's going to happen. I mean, to have all these places shut overnight from being, on a Saturday night. I think lockdown was mentioned on a Thursday, and I think from the Saturday before, where everything was heaving and busy, and then all of a sudden a week later, everything's closed. Everyone was trying to get an idea of how it's going to change going forward. Government stepped in, as we all know. They helped in terms of the March quarter rent. This was a big thing because they helped in the sense of giving eviction and debt enforcement moratoriums. In addition, the financial support was offered in terms of furlough, C-bills, bounce back and business rates reliefs, has meant that many operators have not needed to hand back keys as yet to landlords. And in fact, in the last few weeks, and I'd say only in the last few weeks, since government mentioned that the leisure industry may be open mid-July. I know it's changed a bit now, and we're looking maybe it might be earlier, but I don't know yet. But since it's been announced that mid-July, we've actually had a few operators making a move in the sense of maybe starting to look at putting premises back on the market, because as Stephen says, they don't want to reopen because no one knows what the social distancing guidelines are going to be, and everyone's speculating on that. So but at the moment what we're finding is there still is a premium market, much lower than it ever was, but there is still a way of getting offloading these leases. And in many cases actually we're advising operators to say, even if you get zero premium, you might be better just to try and offload your lease at the moment, at least to get your rent deposit back. So that's one way of getting a bit of money back into the bank. Look, there's no doubt that if government don't intervene for the June quarter rent, which is coming up on June the 25th, we're probably going to see a lot of premises going back to landlords. And at this point, that's when you're going to have rents that will need to come down, because if landlords want to relet this property and all of a sudden there's an excess of supply of empty stock on the market, landlord-led, that does mean that rents will come down. When I say the government, is yet to mention what they're going to do for the June quarter rent, I do feel that, wearing a hat on both sides here, is that this quarter, if the government do intervene, they do also need to put a package together some way or to help the landlord, because not all landlords are debt free on these properties. In fact, the majority aren't, especially prime central London or prime high street locations. Landlords are going to have borrowings on these sites, and they need to be helped as well as the tenants. So it's a job that the government's going to have to do. But so far, the March quarter, landlord didn't get much help on this. But let's see what will happen June quarter. Look, over the period, in any adversity, you see real innovation strike, and we've seen many operators come up with very innovative ways to provide a service. Things like takeaway or delivery alternative, which was mentioned before, turning their once prime and thriving high street restaurant into a dark kitchen, which is basically a kitchen that they're cooking their food, still producing the food, and they're providing a delivery or pickup service. A lot of restaurateurs, I don't know if people have seen, but a lot of restaurateurs are doing these make your own pack meals. So for instance, like Honest Burger, you can go online and you order the ingredients of what goes into the burger, and it comes all air sealed to your home with clear instructions on how to replicate and make the burger that you would get from, sorry, it's not Honest Burger, it's actually Patty and Bun that are doing this, but you do it from Patty and Bun, you do it from Pizza Pilgrims, are doing the same thing, where you can buy the ingredients and it gives you clear instructions on how to replicate the Pizza Pilgrim pizza. Very clever, helps on Instagram, you take pictures, and it's very good. So all these ideas are coming up. Look, as been mentioned, the use planning uses have come up quite a bit this morning, and I'll just touch on it to give an example of how this is a real problem. At the moment, I mentioned people are doing delivery and pickup. So at the moment, they're doing it from premises that are classified as A3 restaurant use. Now, theoretically, really, what they're providing is a takeaway service which falls under the A5 planning use. Likewise, there's many A3 restaurants at the moment that have got garden spaces that are thinking of using the garden space when it's right to, as a bit more of someone can come in and sit down and have a beer and use it as a bit of a beer garden or a bar garden, if you like, which falls under the A4 planning use. So as you can see, there's I've just mentioned only 3 of the planning uses there that all contradict each other and that are all going to cause issues. And yes, it does help to put the temporary solution in place to March 21, but really it's a plaster, and it's a much bigger problem that's going to come around. So it's a question that the government needs to look at, maybe, in my opinion, maybe abolishing this, because as Hannah said, this situation hasn't just come up now. It's come up since they introduced the splitting up, because it used to just be A3 was anything leisure. They split it up about 10 years ago. It might be wrong, Roger will know better, but it was about 10 years ago where they made it A3, A4, A5, and they split it all up into bar and takeaway, and which caused confusion. Look, it's inevitable we're going to see very large retailers or large leisure venues, such as nightclubs, going vacant. I mean, these big nightclubs in locations, sometimes not on prime high street, sometimes on prime high street. What's the nightclub world going to be like? Are people going to still be going there? And who knows what's going to happen there? So these sites are going to become vacant. It was touched upon, but I think I just want to touch upon it again about licenses by Roger. And yeah, I mean, government needs to look at, local authorities need to look at licenses to sell alcohol and for terminable hours, outside seating. All these things will help a restaurateur who's going back to the business. It will help a restaurateur if they're able to open later. If they're able to put more seats outside where they've not been allowed to in the past, at least even for a temporary measure, just for the next year, 2 years. People are saying that this could be 2 years before we come out of, before we see a lot, 90, 95% people back going safely going back to restaurants and bars. So, you know, that needs to be, licensing needs to be looked at in a big way. This will help restaurateurs and leisure operators in a very big way. As Stephen mentioned, again, they need to look into the UDPs because a lot of the time, you know, if you look at the UDP in certain areas, it might say that they don't want any more A3. You know, there was a time in Westminster there was no more A3 planning applications going through. They're a bit lighter now on it, but it's, you know, you really needs to look at the UDPs in order to avoid these empty buildings. I think I agree that in, you know, a lot of the time, if you've got a large retail unit that's become vacant on a high street location with potentially offices above that are also vacant, I think housing is a very good idea for a lot of these places. But as I said before, you know, in adverse situations such as this, innovation is really born. And already, I tell you, we're seeing some amazing new concepts to fit in with what could be restricted for what could be everyone restricted for a while. I mean, I don't know if everyone saw, but there was a restaurant in Amsterdam that has built the, you know, people are sitting within like their own single greenhouse units, that type of thing. I mean, we're seeing other we're seeing other types of businesses with all different types of ideas coming forward and yet to prove themselves, but that could work. But whatever the answer, and hopefully, you know, it'll be a good discussion. We just don't want to have a situation where we're going to end up with many of our high streets having huge, large vacant units, and you know, with a much loved leisure market diminishing, which you know, London and the UK has always been known for its great offering for the leisure industry. So hopefully that won't happen.
Thank you very much, and thank you, panelists. We've obviously got a lot of issues to talk about and examine. I have had some questions by email, which I'll get to in a second. We've also got using the Q&A facility we've had as well. But there's one issue that I think we just need to, I'd just like to comment on. Maurice, you've just brought it up. The issue with regard to licensing and the part that has to play in helping retail, shop units, restaurant units, etc. From experience, having sat on a licensing committee, chaired a licensing committee and chaired a planning committee, I've always been amazed about how, although the systems may run in parallel, they don't run together. So your licensing hours often don't tally with your opening hours. And vice versa, which I've always felt is not conducive to a great business model. It can cause a lot of problems which don't need to be there. So I think your point about licensing hours and licensing provisions, even on a basic level, is very valid and does need a review. And that's something that we should perhaps take away from this and push forward, perhaps in a later date, but definitely something that needs to be explored further. I think if we could just move.
I just mentioned something what you just said there about not there's no liaising between the two. You're exactly right. Yeah, there's so many times where the licensing hours are actually able to open more than they don't unite. But that's not the only thing that don't unite. You know, we've seen situations where business rates they get charged, say, to restaurant and premises when actually they're an A1 unit. They're not even a restaurant. So sometimes people that want to sell their unit claiming that they're A3 will turn around and say, oh, but look, the business rates look at it as a restaurant. And they do. They clearly say restaurant, but they're actually an A1 unit. So the government needs to actually get all unification with all parts of it together, not just licensing. It contradicts on a few things.
And Roger, I would assume as a planning consultant, you see these kind of contradictions all the time between the regimes.
Yeah, I totally agree with what's just been said. I think it's long overdue for certainly licensing and planning to be brought into line to at least some degree, and some more clarity actually as to just what is the responsibility, what is the purpose of each of the two regimes, because it causes endless confusion.
Well, thank you. We do have an MP as one of the attendees here, so I hope he's listening and taking this point on board, and many of the other points that we're going to raise now as well. One, just following on, sorry, Maurice, to put you on the spot again, but just because there's a relevant question that I have that just plays on or continues with what you were saying. So this is from David Fox, and he says, are there examples of an A3 restaurant morphing into more of a takeout in terms of volume of sales, so A5, and their provision being challenged by local councils? If so, is it down to the local councils? So, for example, you have a 30 cover restaurant, which is now less feasible as a pure A3, with the takeout being ancillary. In reality, the sales may be closer to takeout with dine-in being ancillary. What planning would be needed for that, do you think? What needs to be done? And then, Roger, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see, again, this is where it causes confusion, because the reality is, yeah, that the planning, if the restaurant is 30 covers, yeah, and it lends itself better as a takeaway, yeah, then at the moment it needs an A5 use, yeah, because under A5, how it works is, and Roger will clarify, I'm sure, but under A5, if it's got the takeaway use, it will be able to run as it goes down. You can go down the class. So the A3, it follows. You can use it as a restaurant and takeaway, yeah? So A5 is what you'd really want. Now, in the past, to get the A5, it's not easy. It's been quite hard to get in general, depending on where you are, because it's, no one wants a location full of takeaway units, because it can cause problem with traffic congestion, it can cause problem with parking outside. There's loads of different issues, and residents don't like it as much. So it's, but really that does need A5. Has there been any issues? Yes. I mean, look, before COVID, pre-COVID, yeah, there's been many a time where the issue normally comes up when you either try to sell the lease or rent the lease for the landlord, yeah. Because at that point, when the purchasing lawyer will look at the planning use and see what their client wants to use the premises for, if it's an A3 and clearly the client's providing a lot of takeaway and it could be deemed that it's A5, it needs an A5, that's when it will come up, and the change of use will normally come up there. Does it come up normally? The only way it will come up, and Roger will help on this, is like, I would imagine that if a 30 cover restaurant has right now turned into an A5 takeaway, or in the past has turned into a takeaway, and either residents above or local occupiers make complaints about it because it's got kids hanging around outside, or rubbish is being thrown as people are eating, they're chucking the rubbish, that's when it causes an issue. But I think it would be quite rare for a local authority to just come in out of the blue and say, you're running this as an A5 when it's actually an A3. It's only if complaints happen, but you do run a risk.
Thank you, Roger.
Yeah, I think at the moment we have got this temporary emergency PD right that enables A3 outlets to serve takeaways. That's a 12-month measure, and I think we're now about 2 months into it. So for the next 10 months, this particular establishment is fine. But once we get to the end of the 12-month period, unless the government prolongs the measure, then they will need planning permission to switch to A5, assuming that they want to carry on operating in that way. And Maurice is quite right that A5 uses do tend to be controversial, do tend to be unpopular with residents because of fears about littering and antisocial behaviour and vehicles stopping at the curb frequently and all of those things.
Thank you. Stephen, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I suppose just a general observation. I suppose that if you look at what happens abroad, I mean, some of you can remember going to some hot countries. It doesn't seem to be much of an issue in hot countries where you have use of outside space, and it all seems to work pretty well. So whether or not they are as flexible as we are, I don't actually know, but it seems to me that it doesn't seem to be as big an issue as it is. It seems to, using places of takeaway seems to be a much bigger issue here, and using outside space than it is where you go on holiday. So I don't see why there can't be a bit more flexibility. I appreciate there are always downsides when changes happen, but you have to take the rough with the smooth a little bit. And if, say, you have residents who are, as long as it's properly policed, then I don't see it's a problem expanding and being a bit more flexible.
Thank you.
Just to add another thought for discussion, Morris has made reference to the emergence of dark kitchens, i.e. basically kitchens that simply hand the product to motorbike couriers or pedal bike couriers, and they then get sent off to the ultimate customer. I'm not sure those are A5. I think they might be B1C, light industrial, which just further complicates the issue.
Well, thanks, Roger. Okay, if I could go back to Stephen Porter, you're on the spot now, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Now, this is an abbreviated question that I received in a couple of days ago from someone called Alex Coleman. And he said, basically, the question he has is, what do we do about the small shop tenant who just cannot pay the rent? What should the councils and the landlords be doing to help? And when and if that unit becomes vacant, how do we bring it back into use, and whose responsibility is it to bring it back into use? No pressure.
That's a big question.
Give everyone else a turn, but we'll start with you.
I think one of the things about the moratorium on the rent is, which is all well and good, but to use a now hackneyed cliche, it is really kicking the can down the road. It's not a situation where the problem's going away. So that if you're deferring paying rent now, or even in June, because I think the government going to extend the moratorium to August, but it's simply kicking the can down the road. The problem is not going away. So in my experience, some landlords are agreeing to a reduced rent for this period whilst they can't be open. Others are saying, well, why don't spread the deficit on the rent over the rest of the period of the lease, so it becomes a bit more manageable. So say, for example, you have a lease that's got, I don't know, 5 years to run. In terms of the rent that's not being paid now, you can spread that over the rest of the period of the lease, or alternatively, you could extend the length of the lease so that it's spread over a greater period. The reality is that if a tenant can't afford to pay the rent, they can't afford to pay the rent, and you're not going to get you can't get blood out of a stone. So I think landlords do have to be a bit realistic about where premises has actually been empty and where the tenant has zero income. They can't simply ignore the fact that their tenant has not received anything. So I think there are flexible ways of dealing with rents, but it does require cooperation from landlords and tenants. And I know that the government are going to propose a voluntary scheme. My experience of voluntary schemes is they don't really work very well. So I suspect that the voluntary scheme will become a compulsory scheme, whatever that scheme is going to be. The difficulty is that whilst the problem is not going away, unless something is done, it's going to come to a head at some point. And if and when it does come to a head and the current moratorium rules go, I think there could be absolute carnage. And I think the government do need to ensure that that's avoided, because that's not going to do anybody any good at all. So I think there has to be, where landlords can be a bit flexible about rental payment arrangements, they should think long and hard about that. But I think that ultimately there is going to need to be some government, if not guidance, so possibly even legislation, to ensure that there isn't this carnage going on in the high street and in premises where the tenants simply can't afford to pay the rent. And there may simply have to be adjustments on the rent, and everybody's going to have to be realistic about it.
Thank you. And Roger, do you think the local authorities got a role to play in either helping local businesses or helping local landlords? And what should be the role of local government for in relation to bringing vacant retail units back into the market or into play?
Again, that's a big question that we could spend the rest of the morning talking about. I think undoubtedly, yes, local government does have an important role to play. Perhaps more of an important role than is often recognized. I come back to the point about every high street being different, and you can't really properly take measures to improve its health unless you understand its DNA and its particular characteristics, and local authorities hopefully are in a position to do that. But I mean, there are all sorts of things that can be done. There can be flexibility over the granting of planning permissions. There can be public realm improvement measures, business improvement districts, temporary relaxation perhaps of parking restrictions to make centres sort of more attractive to customers who are wary about using public transport. Yeah, lots of different measures that can be taken. But the essential answer to your question is, yes, local authorities, I think, have a big role to play.
Thank you, Roger. And then Morris, over to you. Just following on, actually, from what Roger has just said, there was a recent report that came out, which was the government response to the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly report on the revitalisation of the High Street. And in that report, it stressed the role that business improvement districts should play in revitalising town centres, and stressed it from the perspective that leadership was very, very important in order to bring these high streets back into play and back into the heart of the community. From your experience dealing with sort of the leisure industry and, let's say, the London high streets, would you say that the bids have a big role to play, or is that for somebody else to lead on?
No, I think that I think it can be done in unison. I mean, look, as I say, in adverse times such as this, you've got great innovation takes place. So all it needs really is for people to put forward, like for instance, market halls. Yeah, I'm not sure if people are aware of market halls, but market halls is one of the ideas that a lot of people are looking to replicate, in the sense and take some of these big retail units. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, they'll have to adjust the model, because it's not going to work in today's society because of social distancing and restriction guidelines. But they've got ways around it. As we mentioned, the Amsterdam restaurant with the glass houses. Market halls have got these ways of making sure that it's safe for people to go in. But you could have an area. Let's say you could have a large retail unit converted into like a food hall, like a bit like Selfridge's food hall or something like that. So as long as any government or any governing body within that area is willing to work with an innovative operator or a entrepreneur, it can be done in unison rather than just one of them taking the lead on it.
Thank you. Just looking at the time, I'm afraid that we are going to have to start drawing this to a close, but can I go around to each of you just for a closing comment before I sum up? So perhaps we can start with Stephen, please.
Well, I think it's been very interesting to hear the sort of different viewpoints from different areas as to what the problems are and how they can be solved. I think one of the things that's highlighted is the use class order really does need revamping, because it's just not fit for purpose. It wasn't fit for purpose before, and COVID has brought to a head a number of things, and that is one of the things that it's brought to a head. As well as, I think there's going to have to be a re-evaluation of rents, and also re-evaluation of, although we haven't touched upon it, re-evaluation of the types of leases that are going to be granted in the future. Things like turnover leases, where the the properties are being leased in accordance with what the turnover of the business is, so that it's more sustainable. But I think there are all sorts of things that do need changing and need a proper look at. And the problem with emergency legislation is that it quite often has unintended consequences, that it needs to be thought through properly as well as done quickly, which is not an easy task. So I suppose what I'd say is that in summary, I think that there does need to be significant changes, and that the COVID-19 has simply brought all these matters to a head at the same time, and it's quite a challenging time to deal with all of those aspects.
Thank you very much. Roger?
I think my closing thought is clearly short-term measures to get us through the sort of current crisis are very important and very relevant. But my prediction is in a couple of years' time, this whole sorry period of COVID-19 will be history. We won't be social distancing. We will be using public transport again. We'll all be worrying about something else. And therefore, it's important that whatever measures are taken in the short to medium term are taken with a view to the long-term health of high streets. And we discussed the fact that there are some pretty fundamental changes taking place, and we need to control and manage those changes. So let's not be unduly distracted or inappropriately distracted by the short term. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture.
Thank you, Maurice.
Yeah, look, it's much to mirror the set. I think that I think we're going to see changes. Yeah, it's inevitable because we evolve, and that's what we do as human beings, and in society in general, we evolve. Yeah, and we adapt to situations. Yeah, so we're going to see changes, much needed changes that need to happen. And I really strongly believe, I can say this from experience of what I'm seeing at this moment in time, which is, we're still in a terrible situation because we still don't know when we're going to reopen or anything, but I am seeing great innovation come forward, yeah, and great new ideas that could really work. It just needs the help of local government and government to support these kind of new concepts and new ideas, which I'm hopeful they will do. And if that happens, we're going to get back to where we were once, with leisure and retail being as buoyant as it always was.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear that, at the end of this discussion, we can come out with some positives. We can look at the innovative ways that people have been using space, and the ideas that have come forward, as Roger has said, that they might be short-term measures, but we do have to look at a long-term picture, and we have to see how people are adapting themselves to the situation. But there is, of course, a lot more to be done, and we've discussed, obviously, that more needs to be done in relation to youth classes, also the parallel regimes such as licensing, and examining them in the wider context of planning and other measures to bring planning and housing and our high streets back into line. We need to look at how we do address this vacant unit issue, and how we do deal with void units and landlords and tenants being able to afford rents, and as Stephen's pointed out, different leasing opportunities and different leasing mechanisms which could help and boost the letting of these particular units. And we need to look at other solutions as well, the role of perhaps the business improvement district, and as Roger has said, zoning. So there has been obviously a lot of food for thought here, and we could actually continue for another hour at least on many of these issues. Planning Futures will be doing future events based on this discussion. We have held several events actually on youth classes, but I think it's time we did another one. And we will be exploring some of the issues that have been raised today. Our events for next month will shortly be online on our website, and we invite everyone please to participate. and join in. And finally, I would like to thank our panelists, to Maurice, to Roger, and to Stephen. Thank you all for your time this morning, and thank you all for a very interesting discussion. And thank you to all our attendees for being patient and listening and submitting your questions. So
thank you for hosting, Hannah.
Sorry?
Thank you for hosting it, Hannah.
My pleasure. Speak to you all soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.